How are you?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
I'm good. Sorry, I'm a bit dark here. I'll turn this light up for a second.
No, it creates a great effect. It's like
Thanks.
some spooky Victorian thing.
It's rather overcast here at the moment, so I'm kind of trying to get the right light, but it's all good. Man, love the book. It's so good.
Wow, thank you.
It's
And
so
I'm
good.
so glad to hear
I have it here, the big lovely book. It's
that.
I thought I'd finish it, but I literally have 100 pages left. I was like, oh shit! I was trying to finish it, but I was so busy with everything. But I got to about 400 and some pages.
Those are
Amazing
the
book.
best pages too.
Yeah, oh, damn. I think I had it pre-ordered for like months. It was like I remember when it got announced, and did it get pushed back or was it like
It did. We were going to
okay?
release in June, but there was a strike by
Okay,
HarperCollins last year, not this year, by some of the personnel, and good for them. And so because of that, we lost some space and time. But I think this is a
okay.
better release time because I got more photos that we wouldn't have had. I mean, there are quite literally three or four photos in there that would not have been part of this book, and important ones. Apple
Right.
gave us two photos that I really wanted.
Okay, which ones were them?
The one of Mal on the rooftop. You got to have Mal on the rooftop because that's such a big day. And the one in the Sergeant Pepper, making the Sergeant Pepper cover art.
Oh, where he's standing there with all the other people. That was
Yeah, I
cool.
really wanted that one, um, and they own those two. And then there was also the wonderful photo that Fran Hughes found like 2 months ago of her with the headdress when Mal
Class.
meets her. Yeah.
That's class. And I think it's probably good better even now because you have the whole Beatles now and then and the red and blue
Well,
album.
yeah.
And
Who
it,
knew that we would be living in an era of Beatlemania right now, right?
I know. It's good.
I
What did
didn't
you
see that coming.
No. What did you think of now and then?
I like it. I like the idea of it more than the song, probably.
I
But
agree.
the thing is, it took me a while to really come to love the other two Threetle songs.
Okay.
And I feel like it'll take me a while on this one too, because their world exists so distinctly between Love Me Do and, the end.
I get
And
you.
it's hard, and nothing can really, no matter what you do, you can't break into that, even with a number one single, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It's funny though because Free as a Bird was kind of my I wouldn't say well maybe my gateway into the Beatles because
I love the song.
when I was a
I love Free
teenager,
as a Bird. The video
yeah,
is wonderful.
yeah,
But
maybe the production's a bit meh. I don't like you can just tell it's just like everything's recorded separately, the drums. I did not ever like that. It just no, it doesn't. It
there's
was
also that the Jeff Lynne effect, right? You can't,
mm,
and I love Jeff Lynne, and I love the
mm,
Electric Light Orchestra in particular. But there's that Jeff Lynne production sound that sometimes overwhelms the subject. And the great thing about George Martin is he didn't do that.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
The song would decide what kind of effect it would have.
Yeah, agreed. I think now and then probably is a bit more well, maybe a bit more Beatlesy sounded, but it's not as like Freeze a Bird was definitely more like uber produced almost. It was very like whereas now and then is a bit. It's so the only thing I don't like about it is that like they've totally like um over compressed the whole thing. It's like it's loudness wars to the max. I'm like you don't need to do that. Like you're the Beatles. I don't get
Oh
that.
yeah, and I heard I went to one of the listening sessions for that, and it was it was in the Dolby Theater in New York City.
Wow.
And so it came to life in ways that I'll never enjoy it again. Right?
Yeah.
Because you can do so much spatially in a room like that.
Yeah, yeah. But about the book, how long did it take to actually get it put together from the inception to
It took a
finishing it?
full 3 years.
Right.
Gary Evans contacted me in late summer of 2020, and I got to work right away. Most of it was, a lot of it was organizational because we had no firm timeline for Mal Evans. And there was so much we didn't know, that he had written multiple manuscripts, that he had continued so deeply to work with the other Beatles. I knew that he had continued to work with them, but I had no
Mm.
idea that it really never stops, so that was new. Establishing obviously the parameters of his death was very important,
Hmm.
because there's so much scuttlebutt and theorizing about that. So I knew I needed to get that right.
Mm.
In fact, what I did at the beginning was I created a whole a schemata of all the different major questions that had to be answered.
Mm.
If
Yeah,
you're gonna think about Mal, what do you want to know when it's over, like it or not? Because I
yeah.
I could tell really from the first time I spoke to Gary on Zoom that there would be a lot people would not like, right? I mean, the truth is, I still think of Mal as this lovable guy, but
It's more
you know,
complicated than that.
he lived a complicated, big life,
Yeah,
uh, which shouldn't surprise us, because he was working for people who led even more complicated and bigger lives.
yeah. There's definitely some stuff in it. You're kind of slightly uncomfortable stuff in it. You're like, whoa, especially with some of the women and stuff like that. You're like, geez, man, that guy really got around and like just uncomfortable kind of. You know what I mean? There's like stuff you're like, oh my God, we're like 16-year
Well,
olds and
and you know
17 year
what? It
olds.
probably it probably should make us uncomfortable, right? I
Mm,
mean, that world. It's not Led Zeppelin, thank goodness.
yeah. But then it is a different time. We're judging people by the time, by our time and not by their time. You know what I mean? It was a slightly different time than it is now.
I think that's fair, but you know, um, I think that one thing that we heard from Larry Kane gave me that great quotation about how even Larry, who's pretty straight laced to this day and really put together, found himself changing when he was on those tours in '64 and '65.
Right.
That something happens to you in that circus like anything goes world. And I would imagine that there are probably some aspects of that that are still true, you know.
Mm,
Um, the only difference being there's so many more witnesses to anything, right?
okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, there are cameras everywhere. There are just more people. The Beatles had two guys as their entourage. Today a tour is going to have 200 at least.
Yeah. And like the thing about it is before I even read the book, my whole idea of Mal was like this really, like you said, lovable, sweet kind of almost like a teddy bear kind of guy. And then when you're reading the book, you're like, wow, I would have never envisioned him to like cheat on his wife, which is probably naive of me given what he was doing. But you know what I mean? In my head, I had kind of this image of
Same
him.
here. Absolutely. The same
Yeah.
here. I thought Mal was this lovely family man who
Yes.
missed desperately his kids and his wife, which I think that last part is probably true. Um, he just simply was able to do something that probably more people than we're really willing to admit can do, which is to live in compartments.
Yeah. And what he got paid was just ridiculous for what he was doing. Like the guy was literally like one part that really shocked me was when Paul said that you're my servant. I was like, what? Like it's just I was so taken back by that he would actually say that to him. It was quite
It's a tough moment.
yeah.
But and obviously we felt the sting of it just as Mal did, right? That guy, the guy who does all of that is not just your servant.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, my only answer to that is Paul is a really young guy when he says that, and probably still hasn't figured it out, even though he's 82, and we all have those problems, right?
Mm,
81, we still have those issues. We're still figuring it out. Um, I'm glad that he had the other Beatles to bounce that off of. That's such an incredible moment, isn't it? Where
yeah. With John
in
goes to
real
John.
time in the diaries, I discovered, and I had to put that together between his notebooks and his diaries, that he was
Right,
actually
right.
having this conversation with the others, particularly Lennon and Harrison, about what that meant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of see because, like you said, you're kind of seeing it in real time as it's kind of going on, which is what's cool about the book. You're kind of, it, when Paul is recounting things like the Mother Mary thing, like I was like, oh, I was like, I had never really knew that story. I'd heard him kind of singing stuff like was it Brother Malcolm, but I wasn't sure wasn't sure was he singing that about Mal. But then when you see that story, and then you subsequently you see Paul's spin on things, and especially the lyric book for Paul McCartney got to me yesterday, and immediately went to like fixing a hole. I was like, okay, I got to see what he says about fixing a hole, and I was just like, he said in the book, in that lyric book, I was basically living by myself in London at the time. And I was like, but that's a lie. You were actually living with Mal. And it was, I don't know, maybe it's just, as you get older, you convince yourself of different stories, but there was big
The
chunks he was
problem
missing.
here, so I've been dealing with this issue most of my career because I'm an English professor,
Hmm.
and we write about people like, the Brontes and F. Scott Fitzgerald and, all of these folks.
Mm.
And then when you extrapolate that to music and art, which are social productions, none of it really holds any weight, right? Because nobody does anything alone, right? I don't do anything alone. I have, a really supportive wife and family. I have a publicist who,
Mm.
is really on the ball and it very carefully choreographs everything. If I didn't have those folks working with me, I couldn't write anything. And I like to write books. so so I need that. And Paul didn't live in a vacuum. He lived in the swinging 1960s. He was writing for a massive audience in 1967. So I guess the problem I have, although I like the lyric books and I'm proud that they quoted me on the lyric book for my Salon review, but the issue is nobody does any of this in a vacuum. And
Yeah.
I wish Paul would allow for that. And you know what, by the way, when I think about Let It Be is both. It is both Mother Mary, which is something that mattered to Paul, but it is also Mother Malcolm / Brother Malcolm.
Yeah.
All of these things can be true, right?
Yeah.
Because that's how art works, I like the fact that at one point Paul recognized that, hey, a lot of people are hearing Let It Be and they're thinking religion. Good for them.
Mm.
Enjoy. It can be all these things.
It's very him like that song.
Yeah,
When I heard
sure.
that, it's very
But
kind of,
it can be all of these things, and
yeah.
um, it's a shame when people don't see how it's even more interesting when you're not alone by candlelight writing some song or poem, that it's actually more interesting, that George Harrison was in the studio when they came up with look at all the lonely people, right? I mean, George had a hand in that. Good for George. He was part
Yeah.
of it. That's why it's a band.
Yeah. Yeah. It's how do you think that actually affected Mal? The I think when Paul was in the back of the car and he said, we want to keep it, I'm paraphrasing, but basically keep it Lennon McCartney and not, you know, Lennon McCartney Evans, but I'll give you royalties. And then subsequently he never gave him royalties. Do you think that really affected Mal in a in a did you think it affected him at the time or affected him long term, sorry?
Yeah, I don't think it did. I think anything that was making the Beatles greater and bigger and supporting the Lennon McCartney brand, Mal was all in. He loved those guys. His job, as he saw it, was to help them be successful in all the best and right ways. And that really didn't linger with him. He was having financial problems because he just moved to London
Mm.
in 67. He'd moved the family down there, and he probably wanted to bring home a win for Lily, right? Look, Paul helped us out or whatever. But I don't think that had any long-term effect. I think Mal's bigger long-term effects were things like Badfinger, where he had done that work. He had helped to make that band. He knew he could do a better job than the con men who kept getting involved with him.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think being denied by Alan Klein with the ability to work on Badfinger was a heartbreaker for him. That was far bigger than any issue he would ever have over, should I be paid more or less? He was paid pretty well until about 71, 72. And there was that inflection point in the UK economy.
Hmm.
That was bad for him. But otherwise, he was doing all right. It probably would have helped if he wasn't living a double life, right?
Yeah.
If all the money was going to the family and not his extracurricular activities, that would have helped Lily and the kids.
Yeah.
So I think he and Neil were paid pretty well until around 71, 72. All of that being said, the tragedy for Mal is he just doesn't stick around. He exits the story at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Imagine if Mal had lived into the present day, he'd be loving this.
Mm,
That he would be part of what the Beatles were up to through the anthology, through the remasters, Beatles Rock Band, you name it. He would have been there with Neil, in some capacity, and that would have been wonderful. But alas, he exits the story there could not have been a worse time for him to exit the story.
yeah.
By
Yeah.
leaving at that moment when Apple is still trying to come out of its disarray. Neil is only just literally with days, weeks begun to imagine what Apple's going to be.
Mm.
Mal would very likely have had some kind of role.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
Which is
would have
kind of
had
what
a good reason, by the way, to go back to England, coming his way, I think, in
yeah.
1976. So, in life, timing really is everything.
Yeah, man. Like we said earlier at the start of the conversation, he was a complicated guy. And it was funny reading when he'd write these letters to Lily. You're like, at the start, you were like, oh, they're so sweet. But as it got further on, you're like, dude, you keep saying the same thing and you keep repeating the same mistake. Like, I felt really bad for her. I was like, this poor woman is at home and kind of knowing what's going on the whole time. And he keeps saying, oh, I want to be with you and this and that. And you're like, dude, you're saying and doing is one thing, which was kind of like, I suppose he was always in a dichotomy. He was like, you were saying, he was living two lives. It was like, he was
Yeah,
like,
but it's after a year or two of that, he's not doing a really good job at.
no, no.
In fact, he's a terrible cheater. You got to be good. That I can never be a cheater because I don't have those skills. And Mal clearly doesn't. He doesn't have the deftness. In fact, he blows it from the beginning when he forgets to call that first week or so.
Yeah, my God.
I mean, he blows it out of the gate.
Yeah. So even when he went to LA and he was gone for like 7 weeks and he didn't call her or something like that with George, and you're like, dude, what the, like, come on,
Yeah,
bro.
pick up the phone.
Yeah, like it's not that hard, you know what I mean?
No, and it wasn't that hard then. And even that one is that when he writes that one letter and he's like, I really should be writing home at this point.
Yeah.
I'm too afraid to send this.
Yes. And it was just like, do you feel the Beatles? Because on one hand, they treated him good and brought him places, but on another hand, it felt like he was like their gopher. He was like he just did everything. They kind of, I think they took advantage of his kindness for them, and they kind of knew he just wanted to be around them. And I don't know. Do you think they took advantage of him?
I don't. I really, really don't. I mean, there was that one key moment when Julie's born, and they're like, "Dude, go back up to Liverpool.
Yeah.
What are you doing?"
Yeah.
I think he kept them in a compartment too, and they didn't know what was going on with all of the different parts of his life. I don't think they had any idea. I don't know that they took advantage of him. I think they didn't, because they provided him with what at the time was a decent salary. Brian didn't pick those numbers haphazardly. They started out pretty well. They just didn't grow with inflation.
Yes.
And in 1972 was able to step up and do anything about that. Really, no one, because they were in receivership by then. So I don't think they took advantage of him. I think he was part of the team. He was integral. They let him know that. A lot of the choices he made were his.
Yes. I
mean, he was. Can you imagine if Mal said to George 3 weeks into that really long period in 1968, I need to go home. George would have been like, great. Go to the airport. Here's some money, get a ticket. Yeah, I can't believe he would have done that. And I think the rest of them were the same way. I mean, even look at that last moment when John counsels Mal about there are two ways you can deal with this problem you're about to have with you can be angry or you can try to, look over the horizon and see something positive here. And we know which choice Mal made.
Yeah, geez, it's those the choices you make in life. Like we're talking about the Ivies or Badfinger. Was never really aware of how much he was involved in literally getting them to that point. It was the story is always like Paul found them and he produced them and they became Badfinger. That's kind of what I always heard. And I read loads of Beatles books, but it's only in that I've kind of realized, wow,
And
the
it wasn't
Ivies and
like
all that.
that. I mean, it was Mal,
Yeah.
and Peter Asher points out that Mal didn't need Peter Asher to get Badfinger signed. He had enough clout all on his own.
Mm.
Um, it it's Alan Klein, I mean, he's the bad gift that keeps on killing, right? I mean, he's just terrible. And he denies Mal the ability to work with Badfinger out of sheer cruelty. There's no other reason. We know that Billy Collins is a wreck and paranoid. Stan Polly is a con man and, will be cited in an actual suicide note,
Wow.
by one of the members of Badfinger. So, what Alan Klein does in that moment is really just to wreck them. You
Yeah.
know, yeah. I mean, Paul was really only involved in that one segment, and he did a good job for them with Magic Christian Music. But it was one very discreet moment. Mal was with them, all the way, and was ready to go the distance with Badfinger. And of
Yeah.
course, we were all robbed of what Badfinger might have done.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because you only kind of hear. I never knew about them until the anthology. That anthology, the DVDs or whenever DVDs, videotapes, whatever it was, came out, and I was like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." And then you listen to it, you're like, "Wow, they could have been a really big band." Like
Oh
that's
my God. I
going
spent
into
some
the
time with Chris
'70s.
Thomas earlier this year, and he was describing, where they might have gone with some of their music. He was with them for their last album or so. It's
Right.
really a tragedy.
Where did he say they were going to go?
Well, I mean, they were a band that I guess when I think about the music that is most influential, it involves bands that aren't afraid to change. And obviously the Beatles change damn near every album, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Uh, Badfinger had inflection points, and those songwriters were so gifted, particularly the lead singer, lead guitarist. That I'm sorry, the two lead songwriters, lead guitarist was Joey.
Mhm.
They had some places to go that were going to be very interesting, but they were still fighting about and suffering over 5-year-old financial problems thanks to the people who were ripping them off.
Yeah, yeah. It's always funny people blame. Well, it was always the thing of Yoko broke up the Beatles for years. But the more you kind of read about things and the more you get into the backside of it, I think Alan Klein has a huge part in breaking
Oh,
up the Beatles. You could almost say
Alan
he
Klein,
is the
yeah.
main
I mean,
instigator.
ultimately, I would argue that they had to break up, that they were growing up and growing older. Um, they had really. I can't imagine having a more dynamic career marked by growth than a band that goes from Love Me Do to Abbey Road. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
that's staggering in itself. Um, the conditions that Alan created by being a con man who was, clearly there to loot them,
Mm,
certainly didn't help and created mistrust inside their ranks, right?
hmm.
But yeah, that guy is just so god awful, and what he does with Mal and Neil, I mean, and that organization is truly terrible.
Yeah, there was one thing I'd never know, and I know a lot about the Beatles, but I'd never heard that story of Neil Aspinall and Pete Best's mother. I was reading this, I double read it. I was like, is that true? Like he was with Pete Best's mother. I never knew that before. I know it's probably a well-known thing, but I had totally I never heard it. Like, Pete never had any problems or qualms with him going on with the Beatles. You think he kind of might have been like, oh, but he seemed pretty sound about the whole issue.
Yeah, I completely agree. That was new to me too.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was just like, whoa, double reading that one.
Yeah. In fact, I think that while it may seem subtle at times, a lot of the important work that knowing more about Mao's story affords us with is what happens 70, 72 in that period when Apple has gone into this weird vacuum,
Yeah.
right? Because of course Paul is no longer involved. He can't be. He's suing the others, rightfully so, to get out of the partnership. Really, at a certain point for those last few years, the only people working on the Apple project are George Harrison and Mal Evans.
Yeah. Yeah, that's mad. I always think the Beatles. I think not I think the lasting thing about the Beatles is that they actually ended. I think it's like the Beach Boys are still going on. Well, the Beach Boys, they're not the Beach Boys, but you know what I mean. Yeah, yeah,
Lots of air quotes.
yeah,
Yeah.
a million of them playing county fairs. But the Beach Boys ended, and and we're always looking for a sequel. I think when you don't get one, you kind of go back to the things that you go back and listen more because you're always trying to find out. You're always wanting more, and I think that's why the Beatles lasted. They would have lasted anyways, but I just think that it started and it ended, and there's something beautiful in that.
There
There's a
is, and it
bookend.
created when they walk off the stage, when they walk across the road, they create this mystique that
Yes.
will never be challenged.
Yeah.
They didn't get back together like Leonard Skinner after they were all dead to try to have a stadium rock career, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the mystique has never been challenged, and
Mm.
that's so important to their story. We don't have the album after Abbey Road that is terrible, right? Where everybody's doubting them. The album
Mm.
before Abbey Road is, of course, Let It Be, and they're
Mm.
finding new sounds. Uh, they always can come off as a band. They will always resonate as a band that is rife with possibility, right?
Yeah.
And we hear some of that possibility in those early solo years.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
of
Yeah. 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 Like, isn't
because
it a
there's a
pity
lot
and
of
stuff?
magic during that period,
Yeah. Like
all
the
things must pass, imagine, etc.
yeah. It's always interesting to think or pontificate what would be a if they did one more album. You know what I mean? You'd nearly have half of All Things Must Pass on it because it was so good. Like it was just
Well,
so
if you
good.
had songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and All Things Must Pass, the title track was brilliant, and
I'd put that
Imagine.
last. I put that last.
Yeah, I
It'd
mean,
be a
you
great
suddenly
last
you've
record.
got you've got a lot of really shrewd work. Ringo is he hits some wonderful commercial notes, right? With Back Off Boogaloo and It Don't
Yeah.
Come Easy. Even the stuff on the material on the Ringo album, those 3 or 4 years there's a lot of great material,
Mm,
and Paul, of course, is churning out songs that would stand with the best of the Beatles. Maybe I'm Amazed these are
yeah.
essentially Beatles songs as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of them
You
are,
know,
aren't they? Like definitely
yeah,
made by I'm amazed. It could be on Let It Be easily.
easily, yeah. It is the logical successor to Let It Be in the Long and Winding Road.
Mm, mm, for sure. I always felt John's output, even though he had Imagine and songs like that, albums wise, I don't think they're as strong as All Things Must Pass and Ram and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, it begins to, with Mind Games, there's a dip, and certainly with Sometime in New York City, you
Yeah.
know, those are. But of course, that's the tragedy of that story. We'll also never know what happens there because um, I see a lot of beauty in his few songs he did for Double Fantasy. I mean, who knows
Yeah.
what the 80s might have been for John Lennon,
Yeah. I
especially
never.
with his excitement over the 80s.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because some fans, I would never want a Beatles '80s record with that '80s production. That would just kill me. Could you imagine a
Yeah, I
gated
can't.
snare?
They
A
might have been
gate.
over synthesized,
Oh no.
right? I mean, that's it. They would have been
Yeah,
over synthesized. We would have had something really plastic sounding, and they were always authentic. So that would have been jarring.
yeah. That would be just very weird. Unless they went the Talk route and did something crazy and experimental, that would be rather cool. But Yeah, I think they try and stay in that lane of being commercial, which in the 80s was not a good sound.
No, yeah, and to remain commercial in the 80s, you had to make certain choices, right? To be able to be relevant.
Yeah. How did come back to the book? How did Gary feel about um because he's obviously involved in putting the book together, but how did he feel about it when he knows that people are going to read stuff about his father that kind of changes the light of in which they see his father?
From the very beginning, again, going back to July, August 2020, his point was to tell all the truth, let the chips fall where they may,
Yeah.
tell the story. Why lie about it, right? Because especially since we made a deal with our publisher where we're going to publish the diaries in the next tranche of publication. You can't make up stuff in
Yeah.
volume one
Yeah.
and then have people wondering who are all these women,
Yeah.
no, you can't do that. And so we're not doing that.
Mm,
It was Ringo Starr who said to Mal, if you're going to write your memoirs, tell the truth. And
mm.
Mal did that. But he told mostly the truth about himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think he realized at a certain point, as folks who commit suicide do, I think he realized that this was for posterity and he needed to tell some truth because, you know, when you go, especially in the kind of spectacular fashion that he imagined, you're going to leave a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sad. The stuff with a lot of women, I was always trying to figure out, was he being nice because he seemed like a really lovely guy, or was he have motives of being nice? It's kind of, you're trying to figure that out during the book. I'm not sure you ever really will get an answer because only he knows. But there was always that thing of like, because he was a really nice guy, but he also had a rather large sexual appetite, shall we say?
Yeah, I think he was a really nice guy, and I think he's the product again of what happens when you live in compartments. When you can
Right.
believe, okay, in this compartment, I am single guy on a rock and roll tour where I'm meeting all sorts of people I would never meet, and we're all living in this weird bubble,
Mm,
right? And then there's the guy who comes home to the family and really loves his family. I don't doubt that he does.
yeah.
Uh, I think the compartments are one of the reasons why he can't pick up a pen or a phone at various points, as you cited earlier, when he's gone so long and so often. It's the compartments that caused a lot of the problems, and he
Mm,
built them, so it is his fault. I'm not excusing him from that, but the problem with living in compartments is you don't live authentically.
yeah.
He lived very inauthentically. And his wife nailed it, didn't she say at one point, how do you go from living on tour with all the women and all the excess and then come home to clean the rabbit hutch?
Yes. Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, she's right. What really impressed me, even though unfortunately for most of the time I've been working on this, she's had late stage dementia and died last year or this year. Is I really find Lily to be a really strong person um, and almost the opposite of Mal, who I don't think was strong in the same way she was.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I'm not as strong as Lily mentally, the kind of toughness she has and demonstrates, and how smart she was, quite frankly. She got a lot of these things quite early on.
Yeah. She knew what was going on, obviously.
Yeah, and she knew she loved Mal, and she had come to terms in her own way with that. But who can blame her that after 2 years of Mal living in another country with another woman, she said, forget it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think she's like the Beatles. The Beatles went on as long and as far as possible as they could before they broke up,
Yeah.
right? She went on as Mal's wife as long and as far as possible as she could inside that situation before she couldn't take it anymore.
Mm, mm. Yeah. You just reach that point, don't you?
And frankly, we don't even know how much further she would have gone because, of course, Mal plunges everything into, goes haywire before we can find out if she's actually going to divorce him. All she was going to do
Yeah,
was see a lawyer.
yeah, I
Think
get
about
you.
it. That's how delicate Mal's compartments were.
Yeah,
That all
yeah,
she had to do was threaten to see a lawyer, and they went haywire.
yeah. It must have been strange for him in the way of like, because he's living the life of almost not exactly a Beatle, but he's living in that he's going everywhere with them and he's doing everything with them. But at the same time, he's not living in these opulent houses and he's not driving these amazing cars. So there is that slight kind of, it's strange. Like you said, he comes back and cleans out the rabbit hole. There had to be that weird thing of like, I'm one of them, but at the same time, I'm kind of not one of them.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that there is that discrepancy that you described. But thinking about that for a moment, that is part of their problem too. Is that they want to live authentically, and yet there's John trying to be a working class hero, power to the people, and he lives at Tittenhurst Park, right? Which is not normal.
No,
That's not
no.
and the most authentic of them all is Paul. For a time, I might have said it was Ringo, but it's Paul, right? Paul essentially moves up to Scotland to clean out the rabbit hutch or the goat hutch or the sheep hutch or whatever.
Yeah,
He goes and collects himself and finds himself in that space with family. He recognizes that maybe that's the purifying place to be, whereas Mal seems to be running from it. So I don't know that anybody in this story is really living in the right place at the right time, save for maybe Mr. McCartney,
yeah.
trying to find some kind of grounding after everything. I mean, John Lennon, how many times did he say to be a Beatle, you had to be one of the biggest bastards on earth,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, all I think about is, wow, to make all that great music, you had to be the biggest bastards on earth. But he's probably right, because what they did was they built a space for them to have the privilege for several years of unfettered studio access,
Mhm.
right? Of unfettered ability to pursue their art. I mean, nobody makes the White Album if they don't have the privilege of making the White Album. No singles, everything you want to be on it, how you want it.
Yeah.
That to me is the boldest, most incredible statement of all time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was 55 2 days ago, that album.
Wow.
You have to be the Beatles to make the White Album.
Yeah. And it even spilled over into Paul's the way his thought process was when he was doing his solo album. I think it might have been Ram at the time, and we went to um, Los Angeles, and he booked out the whole day, and they were like, "Well, you can't really do this," and he didn't turn up. It was in Alan Const's book. I think I said that wrong. Like he did this really brilliant Beatles book. Like it's
Alan Kozin.
that's it. Yeah, it's a brilliant
Yeah,
book.
yeah.
He was
Yeah, he would
describing
do
that
things like that. Yeah.
and renaming the dog. I'm like, what the fuck, dude? He got like he took the sound engineer's dog and then he renamed him. I'm like, that was just weird. Like he got him for a few weeks. I don't. Do you know that story? He had him for a few weeks.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I was just like, what? Like there was stuff like that. I'm like, okay, that's just bizarre because you're so used to hearing all, just the good stories and not the kind of odd kind of in. Of course, if you're Beatles, you're going to feel entitled. You cannot live in that orbit and not when you have everything done for you. And even if you don't think you're entitled, you cannot really escape it. So I think, like you were saying, Paul was probably the only one that kind of escaped that out of all of them.
But it's always going to be a trap.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I'm sure Paul experiences this all the time, people telling him what his memories are and what they should be. You know, he can only exist in his own space.
What do you think Mal's long-term ambitions was? Was it to be more like
He wanted to
a
be he
gopher?
wanted to be a producer and a songwriter.
Yeah, because he would write
And even
lyrics and stuff
right
like that.
before the end of his life, he confessed that he wanted to make his own album. His wife,
Right.
again, had his number. When he was considering running off with them in August 63, she said, you don't need them to be a star. She knew he had these kind of celebrity intentions. She was on to him.
Yeah.
And I do think he had that kind of, there was something inside him that had that ambition. But I do know, and I think we all do, that he would just have been thrilled with the Beatles' legacy. Everything that he and Brian and others had dreamt of for the Beatles has all been true and exceeded our expectations.
Yeah. Does Paul or any of them ever actually bring him up in conversation?
I've seen several moments where they have. Ringo has several times in interviews over the years, and there's a moving moment. It's on YouTube where somebody shows him I believe, shows McCartney a photo album with Mal in it, and he's quite moved by it. They
Oh,
loved him.
okay.
There's no doubt about it, and I think in the long calculation, they certainly recognize that he played an integral part of their success.
Yeah,
Nobody is successful without people like Mal. Nobody does it alone.
yeah. With
No
regards
matter
to
how big our egos are, we don't do it alone.
yeah, yeah. With regards to the songwriting aspect of it, with him pitching and stuff, like how well known is that? Because at times, when I was reading the book, I found that he was, I was believing obviously what he said, but sometimes I was I found was like, is he interpreting stuff? You know what I mean? There was certain things of like, is he seeing stuff like that? Like he was adding stuff or seeing stuff in his own manner that wasn't actually quite there. Because there was one sign where he's going up, time where he's going up the lift, and he got this not out of body experience, but he had this thought that he was creating everything. And I remember like that part where he was, if he died, everything would disappear and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of gave me power. Of course, I was thinking, is he kind of imagining some stuff and some stuff he's doing? You know what I mean?
And I can't answer it. I don't know. I can only
Yeah.
report what he said and what he wrote. The thing that gives him some value is he's saying and writing things contemporaneously.
Okay. Yeah.
So for the most part, he's keeping his notebooks and diaries and journals in the moment. So, historians would say we have to give a lot of credence to
Hmm.
what he's saying. We also know from John Lennon and Pete Shotton and others that when it comes to what would happen in the studio, if you're trying to get a song done and you need a line, everybody helps. That doesn't mean that Mal is suddenly taking the place of a Lennon or McCartney. He would never think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
But
he would help out.
yeah.
And anyone would. Pete Shotton described situations where they would be sitting there and somebody needed a line or an idea. And
Mm.
it was, part of their success is probably that they kept the group really small. So the entourage was never that big.
Yeah.
Al, Neil, and whomever they would allow visit, a guy like a Pete Shotton or a Brian Epstein. Otherwise, nobody really went into the studio with them, So the space for ideas is a pretty tight one.
Yeah.
And one of the things we can't ever overlook, and it's what I love about teaching the Beatles in class, is that they're hard workers. These guys don't take a lot of days off.
It's incredible.
They're working on something and it's a good idea. They're going to slave over that idea and get it done the right way.
Mm.
Look at the White Album. I mean, it has all but about 2 or 3 songs that they recorded during that period.
Yeah.
They knew the pieces they wanted for the album.
Mm. It was,
And at
it's
the end of the day, that's artistry.
Yeah, yeah. Like the work, it's strange because you see all these parties they're going to and all these things they're doing, all these places they're going. You're like, how do they get Sam to write songs? And not just songs, but like incredible songs. You know what I mean? Like the like the amount of work they were doing on tours and everything like that, and yet they were still constantly churning out these amazing songs. And it's it's kind of unrivaled in the space of time that they've
It is
done it.
unrivaled, and it's why getting off the road was so essential, right? Getting off the road meant that they could elevate the whole enterprise. We wouldn't have a day in the life. I Am the Walrus. Songs like this that have layers, right?
Yeah.
Even a song that may seem like a pop song like Hey Jude has layers of, a terraced effect where instruments are added and sometimes even leave the mix, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
All of this is because they had the time and space to do it.
Mm.
Uh, or Revolution 9. I know it's not always popular, but I mean,
Yeah.
that's a highly complex piece of work. Dear Prudence. I mean, every time I hear that, I think, my God, the layers of those acoustic
Great song.
guitars, that's otherworldly.
Yeah.
You have to have time to imagine that, or to
Yeah.
imagine the lyrics of, we just did this in class this week, Across the Universe.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Right. We were doing that very early version where it's just John on the acoustic guitar. In fact, Gary Evans was in class with me on Monday night.
Oh, wow.
he had been thinking so much about John Lennon. We'd just been up to the Dakota the day before.
Oh,
Gary got choked up and had to leave the room
really?
from
Wow.
hearing John's voice.
Wow.
I played him a few years ago when I was working on my John Lennon book, some of John Lennon's conversation with Sean when Sean was 5. And Gary heard that and he said, "My God, that's how John talked to me when I was little."
No way.
And he just
Wow.
think about the emotion that exists inside those spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, that must be incredible.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to mention on Monday we're doing the White Album in class, and I'm going to say, hey, that was pretty powerful when Gary Evans was listening to
Yeah.
Across the Universe with us, and he had to leave the room.
Yeah.
You
Have,
know,
ha-
they noticed because they said, why? They thought to them, why is he leaving?
yeah. I think that's something, not going back to it, not going to wait on it long, but something about now and then that actually is quite lovely. It's just hearing John's voice. It's just hearing his voice, out of everything. When you heard that, like you get a shiver just hearing that. You're like, wow.
Oh, you do. And when they played it again at the Dolby Theater, and all you heard was just John's voice by itself in perfect clarity.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, if I'm Paul McCartney, there's no way I'm not going to finish that song when I hear something like that.
yeah. Like people don't get like John Lennon had an incredible voice. I know he hated the sound of his voice, and he would
Even
do
if he didn't like
yeah,
it.
even
Yeah.
if he didn't like it. But I think most people who sing hate the sound of their voice. I mean, I hate the sound of my voice, but loads of people do. But he had such a great voice. And I think when people like list the greatest singers of all time, there's obviously you're gonna have Aretha and all amazing singers and Ella Fitzgerald and all that. But John Lennon has a great voice. And I think people don't I don't think he gets
Well,
the credit for his voice.
and in a band with two guys who can do a lot with their voices,
Yeah.
right? Lennon
Yeah.
and McCartney, they had so many different looks to their voice. Paul could scream, he could have a purity. The same thing was true with John. I mean, you could sing, hey, think about what I just mentioned, right? We listened to Across the Universe, where John has more beauty in that vocal, that first vocal before it gets slowed down by Phil Spector. There's so much beauty in that.
Yeah.
And during that same week or so, he's recording Hey Bulldog.
Yeah.
And that section where he screams, "You can talk to me." I mean, the power of that, damn.
That's class. That's
Yeah,
class.
it's huge. Or in that same period, there's Paul singing Lady Madonna in his Elvis voice.
Yeah.
I mean, those are credible vocals. You know, what a tour de force to have that kind of lead singers at the front of your band. And then there's George Harrison not too far behind.
Yeah. It's amazing how George became such like the ironic thing of it is the most streamed song on Spotify is George's, which is like the most ironic thing ever.
It's
Frank
wonderful. And
Sinatra's
it's
favorite.
wonderful that the last number one solo single is "I Got My Mind Set on You."
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's
That's great.
wonderful. You know,
Yeah.
George was in a funny spot, right? When they were in Hamburg, they all three had a certain amount of songs they sang.
Hmm.
Well, then when it moved to a songwriterly situation in the studio, suddenly he was the odd man out for a while.
Ah, yes,
And
yes.
that sets up that challenge that eventually leads to Something and Here Comes the Sun. And
Yeah.
that last, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that last burst from him is pretty amazing.
Amazing. I actually
He
love,
steps up big time.
yeah. I actually prefer the love version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, prefer it than the studio because it just has that lovely George Martin stringing. I think that is so beautiful. I just think it
Yeah, and
works.
it was a big moment for George Martin because when he heard it in the studio when it was just the acoustic in
Yeah.
'68, he thought, wait a minute, I need to start giving more time to this guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Such a great. Going back to what you were saying about teaching in class, how big are your classes that you teach
Well, I'm
Beatles?
lucky here on the shore. We have our Beatles courses at Monmouth University. Our average course size is 13. I happen to have 20 this semester. I
Wow.
mean, you can't beat that, right? First of all, it's a good mix of really smart students. We get to experience the songs in order from beginning to end.
Oh
And,
wow.
you know, in a 14-week semester, it's a very powerful thing because you are feeling the intense growth of that band's musicality.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
every week somebody will say, "I cannot believe that I'm listening to the same band that sings She Loves You."
Yeah.
right? I
It's
mean, you're
incredible.
listening to Sergeant Pepper. We did A Day in the Life a week ago. That's an explosive masterwork. How do you even compare that to great songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand, and you can't do that?
Yeah. And it's such a short space of time. It's like a few years. It's not like 10 years. It's a few years, which is just incredible. Like,
It's staggering, and it is still, for my ears and my eyes, it is the most incredible artistic growth uh, of all time.
yeah.
Nobody does that. Shakespeare's up and down because he has to be. That he's writing. He's a working playwright. He's just trying to get people in the seats, and sometimes the theater's burning down, so it's a lot of work. you
Brian
know,
Wilson came close. Brian Wilson came close, though. Brian
yeah,
was
but then
just there.
he's but then what? In 2 or 3 years, and then he's had what has he
Yeah.
had since then? He's not
Yeah.
in the game. Who else? Picasso is not in that game. I can't find anybody.
Yeah. But I think the thing about it is that the Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, is they kept going. So you're going to see the fall off of the Beach Boys. I think when Brian was on top, he was at such a level, and it just all unraveled for he. I think the
But it was
problem with
Brian and not the Beach Boys.
yeah, but Brian had like Brian
Because Mike
had
Love wasn't at the top in
no,
1966 when they
no.
were.
But that's the sad thing about it. I think if Brian had a band like the Beatles, it would, who they seem to all be going on the same path. You know what I mean? It was all like, there was no like, oh, I don't do it. It was like, yeah, let's keep
And
going.
you're
But
pointing out exactly why they're the miracle.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
Brian Wilson didn't have the band.
Which is sad because
It's terrible.
I adore Brian Wilson. He's up there for, but I just think
The only band I think I could argue is close is the Doors.
Doors did a lot of good stuff. Jeez, yeah.
And we'll never know. Unfortunately, they make those three post Morrison albums or two or however many it was.
Yeah.
But
Screw
with
them.
Gem, that's a pretty remarkable period.
Yeah, Soft Parade. What a great record that is.
Yeah. I
Oh,
don't,
God.
and we obviously again we'll never know, but they were up to something, and they had
Yeah,
the players. They had the players to do it too.
that's true. True.
You
And like,
know,
you need, as we were saying, you need to be all synchronized to each other. That you're all going along the same path. Because if you're not, it's gonna what happened like the Beach Boys of just like
the first album to L.A. Woman by the
it's a
Doors.
good run.
You've got a great run there.
Yeah.
And we'll never know. Maybe they would have ruined it, or maybe they start making their own Sergeant Pepper and the White Album, etc.
Yeah.
Their
Yeah.
own versions of those kind of master. You're gonna have to forgive me. I got to run in a minute. This has been
Oh,
too much
damn,
fun.
bro. But I really enjoyed this. Hey, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Yeah. But in closing, hey, thanks so much for doing it, man.
absolutely. And
I
by the way,
love the
we run
book.
a thing called Record Club at Monmouth. If you ever see some album you want to collaborate on, we talk about the albums. I think you'd be great on it.
Oh, brilliant, man. Yeah, hit me up,
Yeah, check it
whatever.
out. It's on our website.
Okay, what actually does it do? Like,
What we do is we listen to albums and we play like the 6 or 7 most important cuts, right? And then
Oh,
we
cool.
talk about them. And I think you'd be great at that.
Oh man, is it like a
Be a
podcast?
co-host, with me. We'd
Oh,
have fun.
I'm definitely down for that. I'm
Yeah.
definitely down for
Go
that.
look at the list. You can see what we've got left this year. But
Great.
we've been doing it for this is our 8th year, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, we
Wow.
just did the White Fleetwood Mac album. I'm doing The Pretender next week.
Brilliant.
In fact, tune in to The Pretender and see if it's something you might want to do in the future.
Okay, I'm definitely down for that. Hey, geez,
Yeah,
thanks
I
very
think
much.
you'd be great at it.
Thank you very much. And before I let you go, the next kind of installment with the Mal diaries, when's that coming out? Is there any time there for that?
I hope it comes out exactly a year from now,
Excellent.
so that we can move on to other projects. Plus, I don't want people to be hanging on too long. I want them to have access, because the cool thing about that project is when folks have access to all those diaries and notebooks and manuscripts, they can go down their own Mal rabbit holes.
Right, exactly.
And
Exactly.
I think there'll be new and interesting discoveries that I haven't even come close to making.
That's great. Well, hey, thank you so much for doing the book. I've told 2 of my friends and they've bought it already. So, I'm spreading the word for you.
Hey, and that's right. It's got to be one reader at a time.
Yeah, yeah. They're loving it too, so that's always a good thing. But thanks very much, Ken, and I'm definitely down for that. And I'll fire you an email, and when have a listen to that, and I'll get back to you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Cheers, brother. Take care. Bye bye.